Not too long after I first started teaching, Doc Ayers asked me to go along to Israel with him, which was a tremendous experience, just very life-changing. But one of the things that I saw firsthand and realized much more deeply than I had before, and that is how significantly my understanding of history and my seeing of the historical background, how much that impacted my understanding of Scripture and my recognition of what God was doing within the context of the stories he was teaching. So I would like you to think a little bit and understand a little bit about the broad historical context, because that really does set the stage for much of the history that we're going to be looking at over the course of this semester, and understanding the reason for what God is doing and the significance of what the narrator, the storyteller, is telling us. To begin with, I've given you a timeline, and there are some basic dates that you're going to need to know, and those are, of course, on the study guide, and you'll be finding them in the quizzes as well. But there are some important dates. Now, if you take a look at this timeline, the one that you have in your notes, which you need to be looking at on bottom of page 1 of your notes, and again, you need to be looking at your notes as we're going through the lectures and through the videos, but on the timeline, you will notice, in your notes at least, that there are more than one date for some of these places, or some of these people and events. So, for example, Abraham, I've listed 2 different sets of dates. Joseph, I've listed 2 different sets of dates. The Exodus, 2 different sets of dates. All of these actually are predicated on which date for the Exodus you assume to be more accurate. For this particular course, I'm going to be assuming the later date of the Exodus, because I think that is probably the most likely, although it is certainly debated. And that changes the dates for everything else. So the later dates for Abram, the later dates for Joseph, so 1995 to 1820, et cetera, for Abram. And then the Exodus, I'm assuming the 1275 or so date, actually maybe even a little bit later, maybe 1260 or even a little later, kind of depends on some other things. But we're going to be assuming those dates, just you need to recognize that everybody doesn't agree on that. But what I do want you to see, as we look at this, I want you to recognize that there's just a huge um, gap of time between some of these events that we don't always recognize. And if you're looking at these, we're looking at 2,000 years before Jesus, 1,500 years before Jesus, 1,000 years before Jesus, 500 years before Jesus. Those are huge increments. If we think of how far that is, we're 2,000 years on the other side, which means Abraham was almost as far before Jesus as we are after Jesus. And when you think about the time between them, it's pretty amazing. So if Abram is the later dates, maybe 1995 to 1820, and you've got Joseph right there with him, Moses is over 500 years after that, at maybe 1275. Actually, he would have been born quite a bit before that, maybe about 1350 or something like that. But still, we've got 500 years between Abram, the end of Abram's life, and Moses's life, which is a huge amount of time. That's longer than, if you think 500 years ago, that's 1500 AD, and that's before Plymouth Rock. So that's about the time that we have the discovery of America. So it's been a long time. Anyway, just thinking in terms of large gaps, you need to realize how far apart these are. So Joshua is there about that same time. If the conquest is somewhere around the beginning of the 13th century, maybe 1225 or 1230 or something. We have Ruth following up right at the period of the Judges, and of course Judges follows that immediately. So all of this is the end of the second millennium BC. Then we have Samuel and David and Solomon showing up here in the right at the end of that millennium. So David is probably taking the reins about 1011 BC and reigning for 40 years, and Saul is right after him. So right around that 1,000-year mark is David. And then we've got Daniel not showing up until the end of really, he's taken captive in 605 BC, and we see most of the book of Daniel happening in the 500s, from 605 all the way down to about 535 or so. So that's an amazing time frame, and we're going to be looking at most of that time frame over the course of this semester. So we're looking at 1,000 years of history, actually even, yeah, about 1,000 years of history over the course of this semester, which is a huge amount of time. And we need to put that into our context as we begin to think about the changes that are happening in their world over that time frame. Of course, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are showing up even later. And so the Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, that book, Ezra, begins at about 538, 537 BC, but it doesn't end until about 450. So almost 100 years, 445 or something like that. And then we have Esther occurring in the middle of that period, or Nehemiah is at the end of that period, and Esther's in the middle of that period. So we'll talk about that when we get there, but these are long periods of time. You also need to realize that your Old Testament is not quite the same as the Hebrew Old Testament, and there's good reasons for that, but I've laid them both out for you on page 2 of your notes. And for your English Bible, what you're familiar with is you've got 5 books of law. We call it Torah. I'd like you to think of a different word for that, because the Hebrew word Torah is better understood as instruction, not just laws, but instruction, because actually all 5 books are Torah. And we think in terms of history: 12 books of history, 5 books of poetry, 17 books of prophecy, 5 major prophets, 12 minor prophets. That's really the way our Old Testament is arranged. However, the Hebrew Old Testament is arranged differently. Hebrew Old Testament still has Torah, and that's still the 5 books of Moses, and that provides the foundational instruction. That's why I want you to remember that word, instruction. It is the foundational instruction for what God is going to teach his nation. But then the Hebrew Old Testament deals with the former prophets, the latter prophets, and the writings. So you think of the Old Testament in Hebrew, it's the law, the prophets, and the writings. The Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, which is the law, the prophets, and the writings. The prophets, however, are divided for the Hebrew audience into 2 categories, which they call former prophets. And ironically, what they call the former prophets is what we call the historical books. But they're not exactly our historical books, but they're mostly our historical books. So if you think in terms of historical books, you think, well, that's not prophecy. You're right, it's not. But what it is, they would say, the rabbis said they were written by prophets, but the reality is we don't know who wrote them. And the other reality is what they present is a pattern for how God works, because they are showing in the history of Israel how God is accomplishing what he said he would do in the Mosaic covenant. So what we will see over and over and over and over and over again is how the Mosaic covenant works out in real life. In other words, how God deals with his people according to what he expects from them. And that has huge implications for you and me. So I call that the implicit instruction on what God does or will do, because as we look at what God has done in the past, it will give us a window into what God will do in the future. The latter prophets are what we call the prophets, and so they are the explicit instruction. This is what God says he's going to do. And of course, that is based on, you guessed it, Mosaic covenant. So you're going to hear a lot about Mosaic covenant over the course of the semester, because it's very important. You'll hear about the Abrahamic covenant, you hear about the Mosaic covenant, and of course, we'll learn a couple new covenants. The writings are the later books that were added to the canon, and they are also books that deal with special events. So we've got special issues, we've got the poetic books, we've got the wisdom literature, we've got things like books that were read at the major feast days. So these are all sort of the later books that are in the writings. What we see then, and what we need to see, is where what we're studying fits into this, so that we understand the context that we are dealing with, and we understand what God is trying to communicate through the big picture of what he has done.